Hello, everyone. We will go ahead and get started here in just a couple of minutes as we allow everyone to join us this afternoon. And while folks are trickling into the webinar this afternoon, if you'd like to drop in the chat what state you're joining us from today, that would be great. We'd love to hear from you all. All right, I'm seeing Erin is joining us from Montana. We have Wendy from Kansas and Kristen from Maryland. And for those of you just joining us, we're just waiting a moment or two to make sure everyone can get on the webinar and join us today. So if anyone else would like to drop in the chat what state you're joining us from, that would be awesome. And while you all are doing that, I will go ahead and kick us off. So welcome to today's webinar, Occupational Licensing, from Emergency Response to Economic Recovery. My name is Iris Hensey, and I'm a policy specialist in the Employment, Labor, and Retirement Program here at NCSL. I'm also joined this afternoon by my colleague, Zach Herman, who is a policy associate also in the Employment, Labor, and Retirement Program at NCSL. Today, our webinar will focus on state legislative actions in occupational licensing and occupational regulation over the past 2 years. We'll start with a brief overview and then discuss some of the actions states took last year related to licensing at the height of the pandemic. Then we'll move on to discuss what states are doing in 2021 and what the focus for policymakers has been as they've really shifted from pandemic response to economic recovery. Finally, while we don't really like to predict the future here at NCSL, we will spend a few moments discussing where states could go from here in their occupational licensing policy. And then we'll wrap up today's webinar just by taking any questions from the audience. So again, my name is Iris, and I'm a policy specialist in the Employment, Labor, and Retirement Program. I cover a variety of topics for NCSL, including occupational licensing and regulatory policy, boards and commissions, and workforce development. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Zach Herman, who is a policy associate here at NCSL. Zach covers a number of topics from occupational licensing to unemployment policy and collective bargaining. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Zach, who will go over our occupational licensing overview and talk a little bit more about what we saw from states during the pandemic. Zach?
Thank you, Iris. So this research and tracking that was coming out today in the webinar comes out of a now 4-year-long project that NCSL has been working on related to occupational licensing. So in 2017, we received an initial grant from the Department of Labor to help states think about occupational licensing from a sort of policy perspective. We had 2 broad goals in that project. So the first one was to help decrease barriers to those entering the workforce, and then through occupational licensing, and then increase mobility across state lines for licenses. They had sort of a 2-pronged approach in this project. We had our research arm and our consortium arm. So the research arm, we created our database on occupational licensing. That database is currently on our website. There we have 48 occupations that are licensed in 30 or more states. And there we list out all of the requirements to become licensed in that occupation in that state. Then we also have our legislative tracking database where we track all introduced to enacted legislation related to occupational licensing. And then we produced a variety of publications on licensing, including publications on specific populations like dislocated workers, people with criminal records, veterans and military families, and immigrants with work authorization. And you can also find a copy of our final report, which is a report out on the work done by the second part of this project, which is our Occupational Licensing Consortium. So the consortium was a collection of initially 11 and then 15 states who all got specialized technical assistance from NCSL and our partners at CSG, the Council of State Governments, and NGA, the National Governors Association. These states formed home teams that then focused on what their goals for licensing in their state were. And then the consortium as a whole helped them to figure out how to achieve those goals through policy assistance, through specialized research, through individual convenings, and through larger invite-only convenings in which all consortium members were brought together. The consortium states officially ended in 2020, but we are still continuing the work a little bit through a second grant from the Department of Labor to expand our research, and we still also provide individual technical assistance. So with the overview of the consortium out of the way, we'll move into sort of what we've been seeing from 2020 related to occupational licensing. So when the COVID-19 pandemic hit last year, states were faced with the challenge of very quickly ramping up their healthcare workforce in order to ensure that enough healthcare workers were there to provide care. Because who can practice in nearly any profession is regulated by the state, adapting occupational licensing regulations to the realities of the moment, the pandemic, was one of the things states could do to quickly bolster their existing healthcare workforce and respond to some of the pressures of the pandemic. Throughout 2020, we were closely tracking state actions on occupational licensing over the course of the 6-month period between March and August of last year. All 50 states acted to temporarily loosen licensing restrictions for certain high-demand healthcare professions. Almost all of these actions were taken by governors or occurred through the rulemaking process. This is explained by the fact that the governors are able to act more quickly than legislatures through executive order, and the fact that due to the pandemic, many states had their regularly scheduled legislative sessions interrupted last year as they were unable to meet in person and carry out their legislative work like normal. We will note, however, that there are a few states that ended up calling special sessions or reconvenings last year. These are the few who were able to make legislative actions related to occupational licensing in 2020. So when it comes to the actions that were taken, there were a few different approaches. Most states ended up taking up to ease the burden of some of their licensing restrictions during 2020. First and foremost, there's been a trend of states working more closely with one another to recognize each other's licenses and improve interstate mobility prior to the pandemic. The pandemic took the dial of this trend and really turned it up. We saw a significant shift from requiring every type of healthcare professional to go through the licensure process from scratch when moving to a new state, to states recognizing one another's licenses as valid and welcoming in folks who were licensed to practice in other states in their own jurisdictions, allowing them to get to work immediately. Another common trend we saw were states pursuing temporary and emergency licensure to a much greater extent than we've seen in the past. For states that still wanted to have some regulatory review in place for out-of-state practitioners wishing to cross state lines and help with their pandemic response, there were two approaches that were really helpful. Temporary and emergency licensure allows for states to bypass certain requirements, such as state residency or paying usual fees an applicant would normally need to receive the license. These licenses could be issued by the board or state licensing agency, usually relatively quickly, and are valid for an amount of time defined in executive order or statute, most often until the governor's declared state of emergency expires. We also saw many states waiving continuing education and licensure renewal requirements for existing licensees during 2020. This helped lift some of the regulatory burden licensees faced and allowed healthcare professionals to focus on their jobs at that time and worry about renewing their credentials afterwards. Then finally, we tracked a number of states that worked to bolster their healthcare workforces by calling on recently retired health professionals and current students to lend a hand with the pandemic response. A number of states put a call out to retired doctors, nurses, and other healthcare workers who had been practicing within the last 3 to 7 years and asked them to rejoin the workforce for a certain period of time to help with the pandemic response. Additionally, a number of states called on students and recent graduates in certain healthcare professions to assist with the pandemic response. Some states allowed current medical and nursing students to have some clinical experience that had some clinical experience to offer a limited scope of service to patients. Other states expedited graduation for medical, nursing, and other health students who were near the end of their education, and then expedited the licensure process for them as well. Finally, other states were issuing temporary licenses to students who graduated from the program of study but had not been able to take the licensing exam. So now that we've covered what happened last year, I'm going to turn it back to Iris to discuss state actions on occupational licensure and regulation in 2021, as states have pivoted from pandemic response to economic recovery.
Awesome. Thanks for that great overview of what states did last year, Zach. So now that legislators have had a chance to weigh in on some of the changes that occurred to licensure in 2020, many states are continuing to look at how some of these changes could be beneficial to economies and workforces beyond the pandemic and really into the future. So far this year at NCSL, we're tracking over 500 bills related to occupational licensing. As state action has pivoted to focus on economic recovery, we're seeing a continued to increased emphasis on collaborating across state lines to improve the mobility of licensed workers. We're seeing an increased emphasis on reducing regulatory burdens and finding ways to get workers licensed more quickly. And we're also seeing a continued emphasis on certain population groups like immigrants, individuals with criminal records, and veterans. So far in 2021, we've seen a continued to increased emphasis on improving the mobility of licensed workers in the states. This, again, is a trend that really began before the pandemic, was then escalated over the course of the pandemic, and appears to continuing to be a top priority for states as they emerge into the economic recovery. There are a wide variety of different ways states can work to improve the mobility of their licensed workforce, including entering into reciprocity agreements, standardizing requirements with neighboring states, entering compacts, and pursuing universal recognition laws. This year, compacts and universal recognition laws have been the most popular or the most hot button topics among policymakers. Interstate compacts are definitely not a new form of licensure mobility, but we've seen a lot of state action on them this year nonetheless. Two particularly popular examples include the Audiology and Speech Language Pathology Interstate Compact and the Occupational Therapy Interstate Licensure Compact. In 2020, 6 states passed legislation to join the Audiology and Speech Language Pathology Compact. This year, 15 states have introduced enabling legislation that would allow their states to join that compact. 6 states have successfully passed these bills thus far, and some examples of those states include Colorado, Kentucky, and Georgia. The Occupational Therapy Interstate Licensure Compact is another compact that saw some significant legislative action this year. The compact was new in 2021, so the states that have passed legislation this year are the first to join it. 16 states introduced enabling legislation for the Occupational Therapy Compact, and 7 states have passed their bills so far this year. Those 7 states include Colorado, Georgia, Maryland, Missouri, North Carolina, Ohio, and Virginia. And then finally, another popular compact in terms of legislation this year is the Psychology Interjurisdictional Compact, or PsyPact for short. Prior to this year, 15 states were a party to this compact. Then this year, an additional 9 states and the District of Columbia passed legislation to join the compact. Some of those other states included Arkansas, Kentucky, Minnesota, Maryland, and West Virginia. So-called universal licensure or universal recognition is the other big mobility trend that we've seen continue the momentum it had prior to the pandemic, if not building upon that momentum even more. Universal recognition laws authorize states to accept or recognize certain occupational licenses granted by other states, thereby giving workers greater professional mobility. When policymakers pass these laws, they are essentially promising to recognize the occupational or professional license granted to a worker in another state as valid in their own state. Although the laws are described as universal, each state is adopting a slightly different approach. Since universal licensure doesn't equate to automatic licensure, licensed workers must still go through an application process when seeking to work in a universal state. But the process does tend to be shorter for licensed workers than it is for those seeking a license for the first time. And so far, all the states that have passed recognition legislation like this outline some common requirements that applicants must meet before getting to work. These requirements typically include things like being licensed and in good standing with your home licensing board and having no open disciplinary investigations against you. So far, since 2019, when the first universal recognition laws were passed, NCSL has tracked 11 states that have enacted universal recognition legislation. Another 8 that have introduced legislation, but have had that legislation ultimately fail. And we're currently aware of at least 1 state where the legislation is still pending this year, and that state is Ohio. So beyond mobility, another trend that we're seeing this year in occupational licensing policy is an increased emphasis on states working to reduce the regulatory burdens that applicants and licensees can face. So what does that mean? It can mean different things in different states, but what we're seeing this year is a continuance of some of the changes states made to their licensing processes during the pandemic. Last year, states were more or less forced to make some of these changes, and policymakers and state regulators this year have been saying, you know what, some of these new approaches and new ways of doing things in licensing might be good for workers in our state and might be able to be applied to other non-pandemic contexts. So we're seeing some states continue to work to reduce regulatory burden in the ways that they were before the pandemic, and also some who were able to harness the pandemic as a catalyst for some of this work. Some of the examples we've seen so far this year include the passage of temporary licensure provisions for specific occupations, as well as for students who have completed their program of study and graduated, but have not yet had a chance to take their licensing exam. We've also seen legislation introduced in states to speed up the regulatory review process for certain applicants, such as military spouses, or during certain situations, such as future declared states of emergency. And then the third trend that we're seeing in occupational licensing this year is a continuation of states thinking about how their occupational regulation requirements and processes may be particularly difficult for particular populations to navigate. Since NCSL began tracking legislation in this area back in 2017, it's been common for us to see legislation working through some of the challenges licensing laws can create for immigrants, individuals with criminal records, and veterans and military spouses. Out of these 3 populations, concerns related to the licensure of foreign trained workers has really taken off the most since the pandemic. During the pandemic, when all states were clamoring to increase the supply of their healthcare workforce, we saw, perhaps for the first time, some states allowing foreign trained healthcare professionals to go through an expedited process to receive what was essentially a temporary license to practice. This was a big deal because if you'll remember back to our conversation about mobility from earlier in the presentation, states can have a difficult time recognizing training and education from one another, let alone from a different country. So for some states, the pandemic provided more momentum to reducing some regulatory burdens for immigrant licensing applicants. One trend that we've seen for this population is the removal of lawful presence and/or citizenship requirements for professional licenses. Most states do have this US citizenship requirement baked into professional licensing statutes for most or for all of the professions that they regulate at the state level. In 2021, a handful of states, including Colorado, New Jersey, and New Mexico, passed legislation to get rid of this requirement, either for all of the occupations licensed by the state or for a select group of occupations outlined in the legislation. And then the other main legislative approach we've seen from states are bills that allow for occupational licensing boards and agencies to recognize foreign licenses, as well as foreign education and training for licensure. This means that an individual who is trained and educated as a respiratory therapist, for example, in another country could apply for a license in a state who has passed one of these recognition laws, and they can input their education and training, and the licensing board can then consider whether or not they would be a good fit for a license in that state. It's important to keep in mind that these laws don't mandate that boards accept foreign education and training for a license. It just gives them the option to do so. And this is really in contrast to the way that most licensing currently works in the US, where an applicant who is trained and working as a respiratory therapist, again, for example, would have to redo all of their training, retake exams, and essentially start the licensure process in a state from scratch, no matter how long they have been working in that profession and no matter how qualified they may be to work in that profession. Virginia passed legislation this year allowing for recognition of foreign educational programs for massage therapy licenses. And the North Dakota legislature passed a bill to allow a foreign practitioner to provide services within the scope of their title in response to a disaster or an emergency declared in the state. Maine legislators also considered a bill this year that would have granted a certain level of recognition to foreign trained dentists. And legislators in Alaska considered a foreign recognition bill for physical and occupational therapists. So prior to the pandemic, we saw a wide variety of states passing legislation to also reduce regulatory barriers for individuals with criminal records. That trend has continued this year, and we've seen two different types of approaches for this population. The first is legislation allowing for predetermination for licensing applicants. Predetermination is essentially an applicant being able to get an answer as to whether or not they are eligible for a license given their criminal history before they go through the complete licensing process. Arkansas, Arizona, and Missouri all considered legislation on this topic, with Arizona and Missouri ultimately passing their bills this year. In these states, someone with a criminal record may now petition a licensing board for this predetermination as to whether or not they can get a license instead of having to go through the entire process, right? Getting the required education and paying all the required fees just to be turned away at the end based off of their criminal record. This year, we also saw states considering legislation that would limit how and when licensing boards or agencies can consider a criminal history for an applicant. These bills put up some guardrails for licensing agencies and boards in that they lay out when and how a board can take into account a criminal record. Finally, we also saw some continued movement in the states on occupational licensing for military spouses and veterans. Before the pandemic, many states passed legislation to ease licensing burdens for military spouses, as well as for veterans. And this year we saw legislation continuing to be passed on topics such as covering reciprocity and portability for this population, as well as legislation lowering fees for licensure for this population. And now that we've covered state actions on occupational licensing, both last year and this year, let's talk a little bit about what could be next. As policymakers continue to frame their decision-making in terms of economic recovery, it may continue to be attractive for legislators and regulators and others to ensure licensing restrictions aren't unnecessarily keeping workers out of the workforce, particularly for certain sectors such as healthcare or construction, where there's a high demand for workers. On that same note, we know that some groups of workers who left or were laid off from their jobs during the pandemic are not necessarily returning to work in that same sector or in those same jobs as they were before. Therefore, workforce development efforts to retrain workers and teach folks new skills could help workers get into new high-paying jobs in some of these licensed industries and also help states respond to worker shortages. And finally, at NCSL, we see a continued sharing of state experiences and learning from state best practices on occupational licensing. It's true that every state is different and has a different approach to occupational regulation, but on that same note, a lot can be learned across jurisdictions. At NCSL, we'll continue covering this topic and reporting out on innovative approaches we're seeing in occupational regulation in the states. And that brings me back to our Occupational Licensing Learning Consortium that Zach mentioned earlier, that we've been working with since 2017. So as Zach referenced, our final report for the project was published about 6 months ago now, and it really goes into significant detail about what worked best in the states that we worked with in terms of making improvements to their occupational regulation, what changes were the most difficult to make, what some common pitfalls were, and where states are planning on going from here. You can find our report at www.ncsl.org/stateslicense, and we'll be sure to drop that in the chat for you as well. Finally, if you're a nerd like me and you want to learn even more about occupational licensing policy and best practices, NCSL will be hosting an open invitation national occupational licensing meeting in January of 2022. So stay tuned to NCSL emails and more information or for more information, and feel free to reach out to us directly with questions about that opportunity. And with that, thank you all for joining us today, and I think we will get to some questions.
Hi, Iris. So our first question is, are you seeing any trends in federal action related to occupational licensing, either this year, last year, or the year before?
Yeah, I think I'll throw that question back at you, Zach. I know that you kind of cover that for our team.
Yeah, so we have been seeing some limited federal interest in occupational licensing. It still remains that licensing is more or less considered the domain of the states. In 2019, we probably saw the most federal action, several bills introduced at, both in the House and the Senate. One of the most remarkable ones was a bill co-sponsored between Elizabeth Warren and Marco Rubio, related to, I believe, debt and occupational licensing for people to not have their license revoked if they fail to pay off student loans or fail to make a payment related to student loans. However, we haven't seen any enacted legislation at the federal level, or really any legislation even make it from one chamber to the next. So we see interest, but not a whole lot of movement, and it continues to be sort of the domain of the states. Iris, anything else you want to add on that?
I don't think there is much else that I want to add on that. Of course, with a new administration, there might be new priorities related to occupational licensing and regulation, but I think that you said it really well, Zach, that for the most part, folks recognize that this really is the domain of the states, and there isn't a huge appetite at the federal level to interfere with that.
So our next question is, do we have any information on states using American Rescue Plan ARP funds to related to issues related to occupational licensing?
I'll go ahead and take a first stab at this question, just to say that at this time, we aren't aware of states using any of those ARPA funds for occupational regulation or licensing related issues. However, that's not to say that it couldn't happen. And that's also not to say that states could use or decide to use some of these funds to support potentially their licensing agencies or boards. Of course, I'm sure most folks on this webinar are aware of the fact that many states are funded through fees. So many of the licensing agencies and boards are funded by the fees from applications and user interactions in the states. So they are relatively self-sustaining systems. But in terms of making certain policy changes or beefing up the way that states regulate certain occupations or professions, we are watching closely to see if they do spend any of their ARPA funds on occupational licensing related efforts.
And then I will put a plug in there that our fiscal program is tracking how states are spending ARPA funds. And so if you go on NCSL's website, you can find ways to see how states are spending both previous CARES funds and now ARPA funds. So we have another question here. What states are taking steps to avoid compacts or recognition bills, ratcheting up personal qualifications by avoiding comparisons in the qualifications that are substantially similar? Would you like me to read that back to you?
Oh, I was reading it too. I'm not sure that we have run into any states who are actively working on this, at least not as a state-specific effort. So there certainly are pieces of legislation that we see introduced every year that may address something such as that, but we haven't seen any real statewide efforts that have, executive branch folks on board, have regulators on board, and also have the legislature on board. Of course, the legislature is still going to do what the legislature is going to do. So some of those pieces of legislation could be passed, but in our tracking, I have not seen any examples that I can think of.
So our next question is, are we aware of any states that are actively considering legislation to make permanent the reforms based on governor's executive orders, particularly in the healthcare
arena? Hi, Paul. It's nice to see you out there. Hope you're doing well. So we have seen some states take examples from those governor's executive orders, particularly related to healthcare occupations, and make some of those best practices or lessons learned from pandemic experiences and put them into legislation. But those bills aren't necessarily specific to, for example, like a cross-state practice, like a nurse being able to jump across state lines and practice really quick if they're not part of the enhanced nurse licensure compact. Instead, they tend to be a part of bigger reciprocity bills that we've seen. And I think that something that is really interesting is going back to some of those states that have passed the bills that kind of allow for an immigrant's education or experience to be counted towards licensure. Those are some of really the biggest changes that we have seen in terms of states baking in some of the things that they have learned from the pandemic into legislation and state statute that will be around in perpetuity, right? Or until the legislature plans on changing that. So those are kind of the best examples, I would say.
So then it looks like the final question that we have, unless other people have more questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Are we seeing licensing as something that's going to continue to be popular among state legislatures? I think we noted in 2019, we saw over 1,000 pieces of legislation introduced and several hundred enacted. And then 2020 sort of derailed a lot of state legislative priorities. And so are we seeing the 2021 trend sort of shift back to licensing being a hot topic?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that, Zach. I think that the pandemic kind of threw legislatures for a loop everywhere, but I think that licensing is going to forever be kind of a hot topic just because there are so many different complex pieces and parts that go into it. And I also think that there has been kind of an elevated discussion around occupational regulation in the past few years. I'm certainly hoping that some of our work has contributed to that, in that legislators are definitely a lot more interested in this than maybe they were a couple of years ago. And they're seeing that occupational licensing laws do impact their constituents at a very personal level. And so we're definitely seeing that translated into the introduction of more and more bills every legislative session. Oh, Zach, you're on mute.
Thank you. Sorry, we have another question, Iris. What are the arguments that can be made to those who believe that compacts will cause the state to lose their authority? Does our report include information on how to educate legislators on the most common reasons people would be against compacts and a state-to-state and state-to-state occupational licensure?
Do you want to give that a first try, Zach, and then I can jump in with an example from the consortium?
Absolutely. So our colleagues at CSG run the bulk of our licensing report, and so they are always excellent resources on the specifics of this. They've been in collaboration with many states and professions to build or think about the models for compacts. In general, it's important to note that a compact does not take away a state's ability to license their own people. So a compact does not change a state licensing someone for the first time in their state. So all of those requirements are still set and controlled by the state. What a compact does is govern the requirements for people who are moving across state lines for the compact member states. So in terms of authority, it doesn't change any of the individual regulating authority that a state has over individuals in that state and that license. It just expands and sort of unifies the requirements for mobility across state lines for the states in that compact. And then our state example our final report has multiple examples of states considering compacts and moving into compacts as well. And so you can sort of see from those case studies greater specifics about how those conversations were navigated.
Awesome. Thank you for that response, Zach. And then I'll just add that from our work with our consortium states, we worked with one state where they had a difficult time getting legislators on board for compacts, specifically because of this issue, because they were concerned with the state authority piece. And what we saw really worked the best was getting the legislators who had these concerns in the same room as the state agencies and the boards that were doing the regulating, and in the same room as some folks from the governor's office, and just pulling these people together to then hear from experts who work on these compacts, have seen them play out across different states, and also hear from other states' experiences once they join these compacts. And it was really that kind of on the ground, like in the same room, stakeholding and facilitating that was able to, I would say, bring the legislators in this particular state up to speed to kind of have a better sense of what compacts really would mean for their state and what some of the myths were around compacts. So yeah, all of that in-person work that we can't necessarily do right now, or that we haven't been able to do for the past year, was what we found as a best practice for addressing some of that.
And so it looks like we, Iris, do not have any other questions. So I guess with that, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, well, I will just say thank you all so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking the time. We hope that you will reach out to us. Zach, if you wouldn't mind just scrolling on to the next slide. You all can reach out to us if you have any questions or would like to continue any licensing conversations beyond this, and have a great rest of your day and week.